Ever since the shroud first really appears in history, there's been controversy about it, and there have been questions about its authenticity.
That the test was taken from the very end of the shroud, not where the image is, and it really turned out to be a patch that had been woven by ancient weavers. They weaved it back together on that particular area.
Science was supposed to settle this. Instead, it opened a door that no one has been able to close when geneticists at the University of Padua finally extracted and sequenced DNA from the Turin Shroud, the linen cloth believed by millions to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. They expected a clear answer, a medieval European signature, something that would confirm what the carbon dating labs had said back in 1988, and let the world move on. That's not what happened. What they found was a genetic fingerprint so unusual, so geographically scattered, so unlike any single living human population on Earth, that the lead researcher told journalists he could not say anything definitive about the cloth's origin. After years of work, after sequencing every fragment of biological material they could recover, after running it against global population databases, nothing matched cleanly, nothing fit, and the further the researchers dug into those results, the stranger the picture became. Because it wasn't just the human DNA, it was the plant DNA. It was the haplogroups pointing in 5 directions at once. It was blood evidence that predated the genetic study by decades and still hasn't been fully explained. And it was a question buried inside all of it, one that scientists still haven't answered. What exactly was wrapped in this cloth? To understand why the DNA results were so disorienting, you need to understand what the Turin Shroud actually is, not what you may have heard, what the science actually says. The shroud is a strip of linen, 4.4 meters long, 1.1 meters wide. It's kept in a climate-controlled reliquary inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, sealed in argon gas to slow its decay, watched over by the Archdiocese of Turin on behalf of the Holy See. On one surface of the cloth, faint and brown and inexplicably detailed, is the image of a man, front and back, full body. The image shows what appear to be wounds consistent with crucifixion. Nail marks at the wrists, a wound at the side, marks across the back, consistent with scourging. The face is calm. The hands are crossed over the lower abdomen. That image has never been convincingly explained. Not by artists, not by physicists, not by chemists. In 1978, a team of 33 scientists, known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, was given direct access to the cloth. They spent 120 continuous hours examining it with equipment borrowed from NASA and the US Air Force, ultraviolet fluorescence, X-ray radiography, infrared spectroscopy. They were looking for paint, for dye, for any artistic medium that could account for the image. They found none. The image exists in the uppermost fibrils of the linen, not in a layer on top, but in the fibers themselves, chemically altered. The depth of the coloration is approximately 200 nanometers. For scale, that's roughly 1/200th the diameter of a human hair. No known medieval technique, and no modern technique that has been successfully demonstrated, can produce an image at that depth with that level of anatomical accuracy. Stand in the room where the shroud is displayed during its rare public exhibitions, and you would feel the weight of the silence around it. The air is cool and still, pumped and filtered to precise humidity levels. The glass is thick, the lighting is dim and controlled. Pilgrims press their hands against the barrier. Scientists stand apart, notebooks open, squinting at details the eye can barely resolve. It is, regardless of what you believe about it, one of the strangest objects in human history. Serious scientific study of the shroud began in earnest in 1898, when an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photographs of the cloth. When he developed his negatives, he nearly dropped them. The negative image, the photographic inversion, revealed a face of stunning clarity and apparent three-dimensionality. Where the photo showed darkness, the face showed light. The cloth was functioning as a negative before photography existed to produce one. That discovery brought the scientists, and they haven't stopped coming. For decades, alright, the central scientific question was the cloth's age. Then, in 1988, they thought they had the answer, and the controversy that followed may have been even stranger than the cloth itself. In April 1988, was cut from its lower left corner in the sacristy of Turin Cathedral. A representative from the Holy See supervised the cutting. Representatives representatives from 3 of the world's most prestigious radiocarbon laboratories were present: the University of Arizona, the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and the University of Oxford. Each lab received a portion of the sample. The British Museum coordinated the process and handled the statistical analysis. The protocol was considered rigorous. The expectations were high. The results came back in September. All 3 labs agreed. The linen dated to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD, the Middle Ages. The cloth, they declared in a paper published in Nature in February 1989, was not from the time of Christ. It was a medieval artifact. The announcement made headlines worldwide. The shroud was a fake. Science had spoken, except science had not finished speaking. In 2017, a group of French and Italian researchers filed a legal request to obtain the raw data from the 1988 test, data that had never been made public. The University of Oxford complied. And when statisticians from the University of Catania analyzed what they received, they found something troubling. The 3 labs hadn't actually agreed. Their results, when examined at the level of individual subsamples rather than final averages, showed a statistically significant pattern. The dates appeared to vary based on where exactly on the sample the measurements were taken, suggesting the sample itself was not chemically uniform. In their 2019 paper, published in Oxford's journal Archaeometry T, Casabianca and colleagues concluded that the original 1988 analysis did not meet current accuracy standards and that the results should be reconsidered. Giulio Fanti, a professor of mechanical and thermal measurement at the University of Padua, had independently arrived at a similar unease. Using mechanical tests on fiber threads he believed were cut from the shroud during the 1988 dating, Fanti published results suggesting the cloth could date to anywhere between 300 BC and 400 AD, which would place it squarely within the possible lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth. His sampling method was disputed. The Archbishop of Turin distanced the church from his conclusions. Skeptics pointed out correctly that verified shroud material was not supposed to be in circulation. The data was real. The implications were anything but settled. At this point, the scientific community assumed they had their debate, medieval cloth or ancient one. They were wrong about what the next test would reveal. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a research lab at 2 in the morning when the sequencers are still running and nobody is talking. That Gianni Barcaccia probably knows well. It was in that kind of silence that the shroud's DNA was slowly giving up what it had been hiding for centuries. The Gianni Barcaccia is a geneticist at the University of Padua. In 2015, he and a team that included researchers from the universities of Perugia and Pavia published a study in Scientific Reports, a peer-reviewed journal published by the Nature Publishing Group. The title was precise, deliberately modest, uncovering the sources of DNA found on the Turin Shroud. The methodology was careful. The team didn't cut into the cloth. They analyzed dust that had been vacuumed from the shroud during 2 separate conservation procedures in 1977 and 1988. From that dust, they extracted both plant DNA and human mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed from mother to child, which is useful for tracing population ancestry. The plant DNA alone was remarkable. Species from the Mediterranean, European spruce, North African clovers, Middle Eastern plantains, and, stranger still, DNA from plant species native to the Americas, species that wouldn't have reached Europe until after Columbus. The researchers noted this was consistent with a cloth that had been exhibited publicly for centuries, collecting pollen from visitors and displays from around the world. But the human DNA was something else. What Barcaccia's team found was a collection of mitochondrial haplogroups, genetic lineages that function like ancestral addresses, telling researchers which part of the world a person's maternal ancestors came from. The shroud's dust contained haplogroups associated with Western Europe, with the Near East, with the Caucasus Mountains, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Indian subcontinent, with North Africa, and with East Asia. Every person who had ever touched the cloth, kissed it, wept over it, or simply stood near it during its centuries of display had left a microscopic trace. If you were looking for a single clear population signal, something that would tell you this cloth was made here, handled by these people, buried with this man, you wouldn't find it. The signal was too wide, too scattered, too human in the fullest possible sense. The data was clear. What it meant was anything but. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, a like helps this channel keep investigating these mysteries. The researchers published their findings and, being careful scientists, declined to draw sweeping conclusions, but their paper contained a detail that other researchers kept returning to. Not the most common haplogroups, the rarest ones. Here is what tends to get overlooked in reports about Barkaccia's study. Yes, there were dozens of haplogroups. Yes, the dust was contaminated by centuries of human contact. The researchers themselves acknowledged this openly. The cloth had passed through France, through Constantinople, through the hands of pilgrims and scientists and conservators. Of course, the DNA was mixed, but when the team looked specifically at the samples taken from parts of the body image itself, the areas that directly correspond to the imprint of the man, a pattern emerged from the noise. The strongest, most consistent signals pointed to a genetic corridor running through the Caucasus and into the ancient Near East, specifically haplogroups found at high frequency among populations historically centered in Anatolia, the Levant, and what is now modern-day Israel and Palestine. This is where the story splits. One path leads to a conventional explanation. Those haplogroups appear because the cloth passed through Constantinople, where it was venerated for centuries, and through the hands of Middle Eastern traders and pilgrims who have always been the Shroud's most devoted devotees. Of course, those lineages show up strongest. The other path leads somewhere more uncomfortable. When researchers compared the specific combination of haplogroups found in the strongest signal cluster against modern population databases, they found an unusual result. That precise combination, those specific haplogroup variants in those proportions, didn't map cleanly onto any single modern population. Not Israelis, not Palestinians, not Syrians, not Anatolians. The individual haplogroups were known. They exist in living people today, but the combination, the specific genetic signature of whoever left the most concentrated biological trace on this cloth, matched a pattern that had partially vanished from the modern gene pool. Populations shift, mix, migrate. The genetic landscape of the ancient Near East 2,000 years ago looked different from the one that exists today. What Barkaccia's team could not rule out, what they explicitly stated could not be excluded, was that the strongest human signal on the Shroud came from a population that no longer exists in its original form. And this is the detail that keeps researchers up at night. The haplogroups in that signal cluster are consistent with what geneticists know about the Jewish population of 1st century Roman Judea. Not proof, not confirmation. Consistent with. There's an older piece of evidence that the DNA study didn't erase, it complicated it. In the early 1980s, researchers examining the Shroud's stains found evidence that what covered the cloth wasn't paint or pigment, it was hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells. The stains showed the chemical characteristics of real human blood, more specifically, blood of type AB positive. That finding was initially celebrated by authenticity researchers, because AB positive is relatively rare globally, found in roughly 3 to 5% of most Western European populations, but significantly more common in populations of Middle Eastern origin, where it appears in roughly 8 to 12% of individuals. The blood type, if genuine, fit the profile of a 1st century Jewish man from the Levant, but as forensic standards tightened, scientists grew more cautious. It has not been definitively proven, to the satisfaction of the scientific community as a whole, that the blood is of human origin. The tests that identified the AB type were conducted in the 1980s with techniques that wouldn't pass peer review today. And even if the blood is human and AB positive, that proves only that someone with that blood type touched the cloth. It doesn't establish when. A 2023 master's thesis from Harvard's Division of Continuing Education, authored by Paul Allen Dreschnack, compared the blood evidence from the Shroud with evidence from a related artifact, the Sudarium of Oviedo, a separate cloth kept in northern Spain that tradition holds was placed over Christ's face after the crucifixion. Both cloths show AB positive blood. The blood stain patterns superimpose on each other with a precision that is difficult to explain if the two cloths were created independently. Over 120 matching stain patterns have been identified between them. The Sudarium of Oviedo has its own independent historical record, placing it in Jerusalem as early as 570 AD, decades before the earliest surviving historical documentation of the Turin Shroud. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the textbooks, but the team wasn't done asking questions about what the blood was actually doing on the cloth, because the bloodstain patterns themselves don't behave the way you'd expect. In 2018, a bloodstain pattern analysis, the same methodology used in modern forensic crime scene investigation, was applied to the Shroud. The researchers found that the blood flows from the arms and the back of the hands were inconsistent. They would have had to occur at different times, under different body positions. The flows on the front didn't match the flows on the back. Some scientists took this as evidence the shroud was a manufactured object. However, others took it as evidence that the body wrapped in it had been moved, repositioned, between death and burial. Both explanations are uncomfortable in their own way. We need to step back now and look at the shape of what we've assembled, not at any individual piece of evidence. At the shape of the whole, a cloth exists. Its origin is disputed. The radiocarbon dating that was supposed to settle the question was itself called into question by a statistical reanalysis of the raw data. Raw data that had to be legally demanded before it was released. The image on the cloth cannot be explained by any known artistic or chemical process. The blood on the cloth shows AB positive type, consistent with Middle Eastern populations. The bloodstain patterns suggest a body that was moved, and the DNA, when sequenced, reveals a genetic signature that is real, that points toward the ancient Near East, but that doesn't cleanly match any population alive today. Every individual anomaly has a possible mundane explanation. Contamination, medieval artistic sophistication, degraded samples, statistical noise. Of course, there are simpler explanations. Scientists have proposed them, tested them, published them. The problem is that the simpler explanations don't all fit at the same time. Explaining away the image requires one theory. Explaining away the blood requires another. Explaining away the DNA requires a third. And each of those theories exists in tension with the others. Some researchers have proposed what might be called the convergence argument. It goes like this. If the shroud were a medieval forgery, the forger would have needed access to knowledge that didn't exist in the 14th century. Accurate anatomy of crucifixion wounds, including the nail through the wrists, rather than the palms, which contradicts medieval iconographic convention, but matches Roman execution practice. Three-dimensional image encoding that only became detectable after NASA developed its own image analysis software in the 1970s. Blood type verification technology that wouldn't exist for another 600 years. One controversial theory, Urchiel, proposed over the years by a handful of researchers, including Italian physicist Paolo di Lazzaro, suggests the image could have been formed by a burst of ultraviolet radiation of a type and intensity that no known medieval source could produce, and that even today can only be approximated using excimer lasers. E. di Lazzaro's team at Italy's National Agency for New Technologies published work in 2011 suggesting that to replicate the shroud image in a lab required pulses of ultraviolet light far outside anything achievable with natural or human-made sources from the medieval period. If we take that evidence at face value, it raises a question that scientists are professionally reluctant to ask aloud. What could have produced that kind of radiation burst inside a sealed burial chamber 2,000 years ago? Another interpretation, offered carefully by researchers who study early Christian history, points to the Gnostic and mystical traditions surrounding the resurrection narrative. In 1st century Jewish burial practice, the body would have been wrapped in grave clothes and left for decomposition. If the body was somehow transformed, if, as the Gospels describe, whatever was in the tomb left in a fundamentally altered state, it raises the theoretical possibility, strange as it sounds within a scientific framework, that the image was created not by pigment applied from outside, but by an energy released from within. There is no scientific framework that currently accommodates that possibility. That's worth saying plainly. But neither is there a scientific framework that fully explains the image as it exists. The Turin Shroud sits right now, at this moment, sealed in its reliquary in Turin. Preserved, watched, silent. It has been carbon dated, photographed, vacuumed, spectrally analyzed, blood-stained, pollen sampled, digitally mapped, and now genetically sequenced. It has been prayed over by popes and dismissed by skeptics and studied by scientists who spent entire careers on a single aspect of a single artifact. And it remains, after all of that, unresolved. There's something unusual about the moment we're living in when it comes to this object. For most of history, the debate about the shroud was theological, a matter of faith beyond the reach of science. Then science arrived, and for a brief window, it seemed like the question would be answered. The carbon dating came back medieval, case closed. But the tools of science have kept improving. Ancient DNA extraction methods that didn't exist in 1988 now allow researchers to recover genetic material from surfaces once considered contaminated beyond use. Statistical methods for analyzing radiocarbon data have grown sophisticated enough to detect heterogeneity in results that once appeared uniform. Blood stain pattern analysis, a discipline that barely existed in 1980, can now reconstruct the sequence of events that produced a particular stain configuration. Every new tool has found something new to interrogate, and what the DNA study added to the picture was this: the most compelling biological signal on the cloth, the one that survived survived centuries of contamination and handling, points toward an ancient Near Eastern population, not medieval Europe, not a French workshop in the 1300s, a population genetically consistent with the Jewish communities of Roman-era Judea, communities that have been scattered, dispersed, and partially absorbed into the surrounding world over the past 2,000 years. That population, in its original ancient form, no longer exists. It has become something else, through migration and mixing and history's long grind. The specific genetic combination that leaves its trace on the Shroud's fibers belongs, in its fullest expression, to a people and a time that is gone. That doesn't prove the cloth is what the faithful say it is. The data doesn't allow that conclusion. But it does mean that when researchers tried to match the Shroud's primary human DNA signature to a living population, they couldn't find one. The strongest signal leads back to somewhere old, somewhere ancient, somewhere on the far side of 2,000 years of history. That fact doesn't care what we believe about it. So here is the question the science leaves us with. If the genetic signature on the Turin Shroud doesn't match any modern living population, if the closest match points to an ancient Near Eastern community that no longer exists in its original form, then where does the burden of proof now sit? We've spent 3 decades assuming the 1988 carbon dating closed the case, but those labs couldn't agree on their raw numbers, and a French and Italian team had to sue for the data before anyone found that out. We've assumed contamination explains the DNA, but contamination usually dilutes a signal. It doesn't produce a coherent, geographically specific pattern pointing consistently toward one region. Or is it possible that the Shroud is exactly what it appears to be? Not in the theological sense, but in the historical one, a burial cloth. An ancient one, wrapped around a body in Roman Judea, somewhere between 2,100 and 2,000 years ago, and that the man inside it, whoever he was, simply has not been definitively identified. If that changed how you think about what science can and cannot settle, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because this investigation isn't over. The Vatican has not allowed further radiocarbon testing. The raw fiber samples from 1988 are largely gone. Access to the cloth is tightly controlled. The Shroud is still there. The questions are still there. And the closest thing science has given us to an answer is a genetic signature that leads back to people who no longer exist, and a silence where a clear conclusion should be.